Boy prays with officers every week, gut tells manager to film it. James couldn't believe what he was hearing. The first thing the child asked him to do was pray with him. What could have been so wrong that before anything else, he just wanted to pray? James and the other officers linked hands. But James only felt his heartbeat faster as he heard what the boy started praying for. Then he noticed what he had in his hand. Nothing like this had ever happened in his life before, and it would change forever. Every single day when Jonah Vasquez finished his shift, he felt fulfilled and happy. He thought that he had done his little bit of good in the world when he put his badge and firearm in his safe next to his bed. He would take off his uniform and put on something a civilian would wear. Afterward, he'd have a meal with his wonderful wife and repeat the whole process the next day. Work never ended for a police officer, after all. When James grew up in New Mexico, he always dreamed of being something greater. He didn't want to find a career where he only worked for a paycheck. He wanted to do his part to help people and create a better world. Most kids give up their dreams of being cops or firefighters when they get older, but not James. He kept his dream alive, and once he graduated high school, he went straight to police training. James always thought of his father when he was on the job. He wanted to be a cop, all thanks to him. Carlos Vasquez was a police officer, and so were all of his fathers before him. James wanted to keep the tradition alive. There was one thing that James loved more than anything: children. When on the job, he made sure to answer any domestic calls or anything regarding kids. He wanted to make sure they got the best treatment. James always wanted to raise kids of his own, and it was partly where his passion for kids stemmed from. Even though he wanted them more than anything in the world, the universe sometimes worked in strange ways. He and his wife had always had trouble conceiving a child, and even though a lot of couples let that disparage them, James kept his chin up and knew he could be patient. But fate would give him a chance to meet with a kid that needed help. James woke up one Saturday morning and dressed in his uniform just like he did every day. He kissed his wife goodbye before setting off to his patrol vehicle with his partner. He enjoyed cold Saturday mornings before the day heated up. The two police officers started their usual route around the neighborhood, patrolling and waiting for any call-ins for crime or suspicious behavior. But what James didn't know was that he'd get a very interesting call that day. After being on patrol for nearly 4 hours, James' stomach started to rumble. He was hungry. He spoke to his partner, and they agreed that they were both looking forward to a nice lunch break. They normally stopped somewhere for some fast food so that they could quickly respond to a call at a moment's notice. But today would be one of the strangest ones he would ever experience, and it all started with a young boy. With James' hunger at an all-time high, they got a call over the radio. There was a kid that needed help. James wasn't sure what help he needed, but he wouldn't let his hunger get the better of him when there was a child in need. His partner agreed, and the two of them stepped on it. The kid was at a Chick-fil-A with another cop, but why did he need two more? They would only find out once they got there. Misinformation was something cops often had to deal with. Often when a police officer gets called out, there is conflicting information about the call. It's a game of broken telephone between the caller, the operator, and finally, the police officer. So James didn't know what to expect. All he knew was that there was a kid in a Chick-fil-A that needed to talk to them. That was good enough for him. He didn't want any kid's voice to fall on deaf ears, especially if they really needed to be heard. But he could never have prepared himself for what would happen when he got there. After driving for 10 minutes, they arrived at the Chick-fil-A. They parked their car and strode in. But James couldn't believe what he saw. There was already a cop with what was presumably the child. He walked in and got ready to take a statement from the kid, find out what was going on, and make sure that he was okay. But what the kid said to James was unbelievable. He had never had a call in his life go quite like this. James couldn't believe what he was hearing. The first thing the child asked him to do was pray with him. What could have been so wrong that before anything else, he just wanted to pray? James and the other officers linked hands. But James only felt his heartbeat faster as he heard what the boy started praying for. Then he noticed what he had in his hand. Nothing like this had ever happened in his life before, and it would change forever. The little boy's name was Henry, and he was praying for something that caught James completely off guard. He prayed for the safety and well-being of the officers. But surely there was more to it. Especially when James noticed what was in his hand. Little Henry held a crucifix in his hand, just showing how serious he was about the officers' safety. He prayed that they stay protected in the line of duty, just as they protected others. James felt a tear in the corner of his eye. James was left scratching his head, but soon realized the call had been set up by a fellow officer and friend. She was the other officer on the scene and wanted James to hear what the little boy had to say, knowing how he felt about children. But it wasn't over yet. James looked at his fellow officers with a confused grin. The experience was something he'd remember for years to come. But now that they drove all the way out there, they couldn't just leave. James and his colleague sat down at the Chick-fil-A, deciding that it was best to eat their well-deserved lunch. James didn't complain, being a big fan of the restaurant franchise. But he decided to do something else unexpected. James invited little Henry and his father to come and join them to eat. He'd even pick up the tab. The little boy seemed inspired, just like he was when he grew up. It was no surprise then when he answered the officer's question. Seeing the motivation in the little boy's eyes, James asked the boy what he wanted to be when he grew up. His father didn't seem pleased with his answer, though he said, "I want to be just like you." James smiled at him and ruffled his hair. He told him that if it was because he wanted to make a difference in his community, then he would always find fulfillment. But that he should just be careful in his decision.